Hi, Dr. Connie.
Hi, Leslie.
How are you?
Good, very good. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you for having me on the episode today.
Yes, I just wanted this to be a regular thing where you pop up because you're so much a part of this brand, and I want people to meet you and know who's behind the scenes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited for that as well. So, as your integrator, I'll just give everybody in the audience a quick intro to who I am. So, I'm Leslie. For those of you I don't know, I work a lot behind the scenes and very closely with our clients that we work with in our programs. So, you can think of Dr. Connie as the visionary of the business. She helps us with where we're going and what we're doing, who we're serving. And then my role is more of the who and the what in terms of, or I guess it's the who and the how. So it's how these things get done that take us to where we want to go and who on the team is responsible. So I manage our team, and then more of the organization of the business and the systems and the processes. But it took a while for us to get to that point.
Yeah. So I feel like we've evolved as a business, and the reason why we're doing this in this way is because it's one thing when you talk about yourself, but we wanted to make sure that whatever I take away or talk about today in you guys getting to know me, that you kind of see yourselves in the role that I play in my own health and my journey, both as a patient, but also as a practitioner. That episode will come later because this is a series, right, Leslie?
Yes, three-part series.
Yeah. So today I really wanted Leslie to ask me questions and prompt me and keep me in line with the goal of making sure that you guys all listening take away with the values that we add to the conversation, not so much about talking about me so much, but I think in my journey and all that I've experienced, if you understood sort of how this program and all the offerings that we offer here at Dr. Connie Cheung, as well as through functional yoga medicine, how that came to be, I feel like you guys would be better connected with what we have to share. And I think that's hugely important.
Yes, I agree. And I think it's a great way for our audience to get to know you a little bit more, Dr. Connie, because as a practitioner, you do practice very differently than many other practitioners in the same industry. And so that's kind of what I think this series is going to show everybody is thinking about aspects related to their health that many people might not think about. Like we all know diet plays a role, exercise plays a role, even stress management, but there's other things we don't think about. And this episode in particular is about relationships. And so that's what we're going to get into today is more about your relationships throughout your life and how that influenced your health.
Yeah. So for those of you who are just joining, I immigrated from South Korea back when I was just 10 years old. So when I came to the States, it was going right into fourth grade level elementary school. It was a culture shock. It was everything shock. Didn't speak a word of English and everything was foreign. All I knew was that prior to this happening, I was separated from my parents because they had to come here, go through the whole immigration process with my grandmother and settle down for us to come, the four of us. I am one of four. I am the youngest of four children. I have a twin sister and then two older brothers. So what I didn't connect to my illness back then, or even I think Leslie, I started to talk about this maybe about a decade ago. I started to like kind of realize some things through my relationship. And that's when I started to connect the dots with relationships and how important that relationship is in your overall health and wellness. And when I came to the States, English being my new language, I remember being reprimanded or I wasn't reprimanded, corrected, but I was hugely shamed. Basically, when you don't speak the language, I was so focused on other kids not making fun of me, being new to the country. And my parents never being around, they didn't speak the English either. So I was left to fend for myself. And I remember in fourth grade, I was asked to read a passage in a book that we were reading collectively as a class. And that paragraph, I mean, my pronunciation was far from perfect. And I remember everybody started to laugh. And I just remember being so mortified. And you think I speak very well, good English, but out of the four kids, because I grew up in Los Angeles, where we really didn't need to learn the language because everybody else was Korean or Asian. So I didn't realize how shielded I was in my own culture, because my parents too had a big business there, but they never really learned the English. They always relied on us. And then they had their CPA, all the professionals like the doctors, everything that they needed were, you know, doing business with each other, other Koreans that spoke the language, even the realtor, right? So there was no need. But I realized that I always carried that chip in my shoulder. And I mentioned that fourth grade incident because out of all my siblings, they're still very much Korean in culture. I've always been more open, and I've always been more focused in, I don't know, more perfectionistic ways. And that's why I wanted to sort of talk about, or I realized later on as I developed autoimmune condition and far into studying holistic treatments for my condition and getting the certifications, I realized, my gosh, the field of study, like medical studies, is just does not provide you with, practitioner or the patient, with the full picture of everything else that's going on in their lives. And then I've come to really recognize the importance of relationships, because it's hugely emotional, mental, as well as spiritual. But it's all of the relationships. And I go back to the fourth grade, and that's what caused me to have this perfectionistic ways, thinking that perfectionism was the way to go. And I come from a culture, Korean culture is very much, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I perceive the culture to be very vain, because my mom placed a lot of emphasis on your body weight, your aesthetics, the way you carry yourself, and girls needed to be pretty. And if you are not pretty, you better be smart. And so between the two of us, the twins, my mom always thought my sister was pretty one and I was a smart one. And so I think that kind of labeling, that sort of started to shape me. And anything that I can do to please my mom, the relationship between the mother and the daughter, I did. And it wasn't until later on in my life, where I had my own kids, that I started to have these deep inner struggles and the triggers that she would bring out about me.
Okay.
And so,
let me ask you this. So you mentioned perfectionism. How else, looking back now, would you say you perceived yourself, especially after that experience of coming to a new country, having to learn a new language, and just going right into a school in fourth grade where a lot of kids probably already knew each other. A lot of them were natural English speakers. How did that make you feel? How did you start to perceive yourself?
I think I didn't know it then. I didn't know it until way later, that I always felt like I was second class, as in I'm never good enough. I'm never going to amount to much. And in order for me to catch up to fourth grade level English, I'm going to have to do double, triple time. And for me to like be perceived as equal to them, equal meaning I knew I would never, in my mind, I would never measure up to them, because I was already so far behind, 10 years behind them, right? So I think that's when I realized that was what I was. The story I told behind the scenes was, Connie, you're never good enough. You have to work harder than anybody else, and you don't stop until things get done. And even when you do achieve, because you know the didactic education, I have my psychology degree, I have my master's degree, and I have my doctorate degree. Even then, I felt like fraud. I wasn't good enough, and I don't know how I did it, but I did it. And so that's when I started to realize, and with the autoimmunity, that, oh my gosh, the relationship, I didn't even know about the relationship with self, right?
Right.
And there was a lot of relationships when it came to health and wellness as well. And so, does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. And then it sounds like, based on what you started to talk about with the Korean culture, that also conditioned you into that, everything has to be perfect. I have to measure up. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe your relationship with your parents and
Yeah.
how that might have led to that mindset as well?
Yeah. Well, I think in my little mind, the fact that I was pretty much orphaned, I felt like, between the age of 8 to 10, and that's Korean age, that was 7 to 9. So that's very formative years to be separated from your family, uprooted just all of a sudden. And I remember, and I don't remember all that time, but I do remember there was a lot of difficult moments in the four of us. And it's really ironic, or not ironic, but it's very surprising to me that four of us have very different perceptions about that period of life. And what I meant by the Korean culture is, over here, we're kind of equal. The way I raise my children is I want them to come to me, talk to me about everything. And I feared my dad. It wasn't a lovey-dovey relationship. I knew they loved me. They provided for me, but there wasn't small talks. As for my mom, I was the unruly child. My sister was the pristine, obedient. I was never obedient. I was always very curious, and I was a tomboy. My mom didn't like that because I didn't fit the epitome of perfect and pristine and pretty. I was always out doing my own thing, despite what my mom said, getting into trouble. And so that too sort of shaped my mind to say, I'm abnormal. I'm so different, but I can't help myself. And that sort of, I think, latched onto that. And then I always was the one, like, if I can win at something, it was my discipline and my effort. I would be the last one standing if it required that much effort. I can stay up later, I can study harder, longer hours, all that stuff. And I didn't realize that the relationship that I had with my mom, no fault of her own, but it was just what I perceived, was really terrible or degrading to my own self-confidence and self-esteem. In fact, external validation was the way of my life when I was younger, when I was coming up, puberty and otherwise.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit more about that and how external validation was kind of the motivation for you to do certain things, especially as you got more into getting your degrees and all that? Is that true?
Yeah. My mom emphasized how, I think Korean women are very suppressed by their men. Like, men have superiority, especially in my mom's generation of women and men. And so having daughters was like not a good thing as it is today. There's a lot more equality. But prior to that, there wasn't so much equality. And I remember my mom being so suppressed, she didn't get to do the education part in Korea because my grandmother forbade her to go further school because it wasn't worth their investment, because she was just going to be married off anyway. So they did marry her off to my dad, who was, very well-to-do. And after that, I think she felt like if there was one thing that she wanted, she tried to live her life vicariously, and by driving me harder to tell me women can achieve more, don't get married, stay single, do all the things. And so I just wanted to please my mom, and I just studied, and things came naturally and easy. And I did that until I got lupus at the tail end of, as I was graduating from a doctorate program. So that was both devastating for my mom as well as for myself.
Okay. So it sounds like you had a conditioning that started in your childhood and kind of formed the way you showed up in your life as you got older, and then eventually leading to the diagnosis that you just mentioned. Can you talk a little bit more about what your life looked like, maybe in school leading up to the diagnosis, and retrospectively looking back, what are some things you think led to that diagnosis as well?
Yeah. So I remember I studied, as I told you, I studied psychology in college. And ever since I was in high school, the vanity metrics back then, Jane Fonda was big, and to be fit and slim was the way to go. And so I started to exercise at an early age. And I didn't know it again at the time, but I was heavier than my twin counterpart. So there was always this unspoken, well, sometimes spoken, um, comments being made about my weight by my mom, certain clothes, the way it should fit, the way it should not fit. And so I used exercise as a way for me to work harder. My sister never had to exercise. She can eat all the things and never gain weight. Versus I felt like the more, I didn't know it at the time, the more I obsessed over my weight, the more inflammation I was creating for myself. And it started then. And you can say eating disorders are not just about bulimia and anorexia. It's just having a very negative relationship with food, your body, as well as exercise, because I used exercise to punish myself for one too many cookies, for example. And then when the weight, I would go immediately weigh myself. And if I went up, I didn't even know back then that muscles weigh more, but I weighed so much of that number and I wanted to look a certain way. And it wasn't what I wanted. It was what I taught and the conditioning that I received. So that relationship began early. And then I got to studying nutrition in at Loma Linda University for my master's. And I remember, one of the instructors saying, everybody has 5 pounds to lose. And you're right. I've never been a big person, but it just in my household, the way I was conditioned by mom, because I was a little heavier than my sister, and I'm also taller. So that didn't even matter.
Mm-hmm.
But I placed so much weight on what she said that in my mind, I didn't question it. I just was just locked into that. And it was unrealistic. And I know now what I didn't know then is that had I been more at peace with who I was and somebody cultivating a better relationship, and again, no fault to my mom, that's all she knew. And it's her upbringing as well, right? But what I learned from that experience is to be conditioned in that way, everybody shares in that because I've been in clinical practice almost 30 years now. And then the more patients that I meet, I'm like, everybody has the same story. We all have these dramas. And it's the stories in our head that goes to show you that we don't have control over our parents. We don't have control over those who shape us. But we do have control over who we think, our thoughts and our feelings that we hold about ourselves. And I think it's time that we start to pay more attention to that, because I do believe that that's what created the sickness leading up. Because again, that perfectionistic viewpoint of getting straight A's, doing the best that I could, and studying. And I stressed myself out. And that was just not necessary. It's not
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So would you say the stress is what played a big part in
absolutely
your health decline?
Absolutely. I was vegan because Loma Linda is one of the blue zones and everybody's vegetarian there. In fact, on campus, you can't get any meat, right?
Mm.
And so me coming from a secular college or university, it was brand new culture for me. And I remember adopting that vegan lifestyle just because it was adopted. It was the thing to do because that's what I was studying, but it wasn't right for my body type. In fact, when I was first diagnosed, I went from doctor to doctor to figure out what was going on because I was having alopecia, meaning patches of hair loss, bald spots in my head. That was devastating for somebody who, like me, who's learned to grow up to be vain. And then I had malar rash so bad around my face that was so embarrassing. And I remember going to dermatology, infectious disease, and everybody else, and nobody can figure it out. And so I went to a traditional Chinese medical doctor, and he measured my pulse, and he said I was a certain type of body type. It's called, um, gosh, it's called Te It's one of the 4 body types in Sasang traditional Chinese medicine. That's how I was intrigued by that. And he said, you need to eat meat, not just any meat, but red meat. And it's the worst kind of comment that you can make to somebody who's vegan. But at that time, all I knew was what I'm doing is not working. So I better adopt something that he's saying. So I blindly followed. And a few months later, and I took his concoction of herbals that he prescribed, and I was antibody free. And I became that way just prior to my wedding.
Okay. So at the same time when all this was going on, tell me a little bit about your home life. I think you just mentioned you were about to get married.
Yeah. So I was one of those women, and my mom was very, very for this. And again, like I was her puppet, if you will. I was not going to get married. I was going to have a health and wellness business, and I was just going to be a big name in this and doing all the things. But when I got autoimmunity, it really crashed all my dreams. Like everything overnight just seemed like it went away. And I became a recluse. I fell into deep depression. And I remember being really, really stressed. And that's when, through somebody's introduction, I met my then husband or ex-husband, and he happened to go to Loma Linda as well. And so we met, and sure enough, we got married. But I probably was looking at having more security in my life. And I mean, that's what I'm thinking at that time, because I was so full of fear. And I didn't know back then in the 90s, when you looked, we didn't have internet, number one. Number two, the books on lupus pretty much said you had 10 years. And so I thought my life was going to be over. Why go into health and wellness? And that was my way of just gaining some security.
Okay. And going deeper into that, what were your doctors telling you about lupus at that time?
That lupus is an incurable disease, that you have to take medications, and that it's almost like you have a burning fire within you. And that's my rheumatologist said. And you have to be one step ahead of the game to knock out the fire. That meant for life, I would have to be dependent on either Plaquenil, prednisone, or some combo of both. And, you know, when you had months and months, almost a year worth of symptoms that you were, you know, feeling so bad about, number one, I felt good to know that somebody knew what they were doing. Like I knew what I had. It wasn't a death sentence. And number two, there was a solution for it, but the solution was the medication. And then when I started to read up on the side effects to those medications, that's when it really stirred me up a little bit, because right after I got married, shortly after this, because I was married shortly after being diagnosed. And when I got married, I had my son within the year. And when I had a child, it meant everything for me at that point to stay as healthy as possible, because I felt like I was somebody who couldn't have kids. I should take it easy in my career, work part-time, and just take it easy, you know? And so I thought that's what I needed a husband to be able to do that. And so, yeah. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it did. And so can you share a little bit more on the topic of relationships? Can you share a little bit more about that husband at the time and what your home life looked like? Because based off what I've heard from your story in the past, it didn't really matter what you did for your health, right? Because you were going home to an environment that wasn't conducive to healing.
Well, when I had my child 1 year into it, Korean culture is that once you get married, you don't think about getting divorced, at least not in my family, right?
Right.
It doesn't matter what the person wants. We care more about like shaming the family name, right? And so I remember there were some things that happened even prior to my son being born, it was a tough year because we fought a lot. We pretty much fought every day. And sometimes things were very violent, and sometimes it was through words, and other times it was throwing stuff around. It wasn't the most secure environment that I placed myself. And so despite that, I was married. And so we uprooted and moved to Georgia from California. And I remember my nightmare began after that, because shortly after that, I was not only lonely, I was isolated with his family, like, because that's all. His sister was here, and his family went with us, or his parents did. And I remember just the only thing that I had was just breastfeeding my child and my child. And so my life revolved around my child. And I remember thinking, I just have to sacrifice this and do the best I can. And so my environment at home was far from perfect. It was so stressful.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, a year and a half into breastfeeding my child, I started to develop heavy edema. I gained probably 20 pounds in under a week. Something was wrong. And so I remember I went to out of state to do a continuing education course. And the doctor advised me to fly home right away. He said it's dangerous for me to be out and about. And so when he checked the labs, he said I had proteinuria, nephrotic syndrome, so bad. The numbers were skyrocketed. I had to start chemotherapy right away. And so I remember that. And again, lack of support at home, because in Korean culture, to have a disease, it's very shameful. I mean, well, at least that's the message that I was getting. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So I remember, oh my gosh, I have to do better. I have to do better. I have to get well. And I did all that to make up for my sickness. I feel like I tried even harder to satisfy everybody in the family, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and my husband at the time, and doing the best I can for my child.
Right. So what do you think had to change? Because obviously you're not in that situation anymore. What do you think you had to learn and change in order to get out of that? I think many people can relate to having stress at home, or, unhappy relationships.
Yeah, thank you for asking such great questions, because I don't think I ever really said it this, in an organized way this way.
Yeah.
But what did change for me was I knew that my health was on the line. I had difficulty even with having intimacy with him. And he had advised me to go seek help for that. And so I did. I went to the functional medical doctor, and that's what intrigued me to get certified in functional medicine.
Okay.
And I remember, despite getting the hormones, despite getting on the supplements, despite getting all the things and changing my diet, nothing really improved with my lupus. And the doctor said, you needed to be really careful. Well, I had my second child in 2007. My first child was born in 2003, but because of chemotherapy, I had to wait 4 years. Well, I had the same exact thing happen again in 2007 after my second one was born, went through the same thing with my kidney flare. And then chemotherapy again, everything came back normal. And then I pursued the functional medicine, and I did everything. I was impeccable with my diet. Like, I was doing everything. Just practicing juicing every morning and doing all the supplements and getting on an elimination diet. And I stayed on that probably for over a decade, I would say, or a good 8 years or so. And then I started to see my own patients, and I had my own business, and my patients weren't really getting better despite all those things that I was doing.
Okay.
And I don't want to get ahead of myself, Leslie. So stop me, and you can veer me however, because I don't know if I went into the next thing.
Okay. Let's just sum it up for everybody and tell me, what was your biggest realization in terms of your relationships throughout your life? Because we talked about childhood, your family, and then your first husband. So what did you realize about relationships and their role in your health?
I remember what you asked me, what changed from my marriage that made me be better about and think about my relationship. Well, my son, the firstborn, was turning 10 that year. I remember there was a big, huge fight breakout, and there were some things that shouldn't have been said. There were some things that happened in my house that shouldn't have happened. And then I realized my son, Dylan, was my other younger son, was 6 at the time, and the older one was 10. I realized I don't want them growing up to be exactly like that, right? And so I realized there was this personal relationship, and I talk about the use of yoga a lot because that's when I really got heavy into yoga, because it was my escape from my reality, because it allowed me space and time for me. And then I began to realize, oh my gosh, not so much about my ex. It wasn't so much about anything else. It was my lack of self-respect and self-worth that drove me to those kind of rock bottom situations where I condoned that kind of behavior from other people, namely my ex-husband at the time, because I believe in any given relationship, we play a role no matter what we recognize or not. We are allowing and being complacent, or we're fighting back or whatever. And sometimes I think two people just aren't compatible. And when we stay in those kind of relationships, I realized I was doing better and I was doing better. And I was told myself, I'm going to do better. I'm going to do better. I'm going to do better, because no matter who I spoke to in my family, nobody was going to talk about the divorce. Nobody was going to recommend divorce, right? And coming from a Christian Korean family, that was not something you did. It wasn't until that time I realized I have to choose me. And better yet, I have 2 boys that I have to be responsible for. What do they get taught by somebody who doesn't have self-worth enough to speak up? Are they going to think that every woman that they meet, they can do that to? Because boys see what they do, right? It's the conditioning.
Mhm.
And I wasn't purposefully conditioning them, but I was taking part in that. So that's still my responsibility. And
Right.
that's what gave me the courage to go, and without thinking about the secondary consequences. And I remember cutting everybody off in my family because I felt like I'm not going to ask any of you. And in fact, I'm just going to withdraw. And in fact, my ex-husband had to contact everybody to try to change my mind. But I was like, I was done. And that was just for myself. And I remember feeling so liberated. And what you have to know about me is that I'm a planner. I need to know what next month, month after, next year looks like. And I have a goal for everything. But I had no goal. Everything was, I was like, I need to do this for me. And that was, I feel like that was the turning point of my life where I really started to go deeper into this work. And that's why I love yoga so much, because I feel like it's the one practice that drew me to myself. And
Okay.
I've cultivated that self-awareness about everything. And it just continues to get better every year.
Yeah, that's amazing. So it sounds like the relationship we have with ourselves is the most important. Is that what you would say?
The relationship with ourselves is the most important, but sometimes you don't see that. You know, if somebody were to tell me, hey, your relationship, you have to love yourself, you have to love yourself, like I wouldn't have gotten that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was layer by layer, connected through the breath. You start to recognize, ooh, my tendencies, because when you have awareness, you recognize your tendencies with food. And then you recognize your tendencies for your need to exercise. You recognize your anxiety builds around food. Like, those are the things I started to notice. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I better stop this right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned, because knowing what to eat, I mean, that was a no brainer. Like, I knew that. I've studied that for over 2 decades, right? I know
Mm-hmm.
what to eat. But that wasn't enough to heal my gut, because my gut is really tied to who I am, right? My nervous system needed to be regulated, because one thing that I want to tie the loop for everybody is, during this whole time, I was the most anxious person you can be around. I was so like flighty and just always on the go. Like, gotta go, go, go. Just staying busy was the name of the game for me. Because
Mm-hmm.
for me, it was about staying busy enough to numb the pain that I was feeling underneath it all. So, yes, to answer your question, I know now that self relationship with yourself is the most important relationship. And I believe it's not something that we learn. And I believe it's a big piece of the puzzle when it comes to health and wellness, because our relationship with ourselves, with other people, with exercise and health and everything else, our relationship is not separate from our health and wellness. And yet, most people, even in the didactic field of physical therapy, nutrition, and psychology, and functional medicine or yoga, everything's about the practice, right? The dogma of yoga, or the dogma of functional yoga medicine, or holistic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine. But nobody really puts everything together in an integrative way for you to experience and recognize the full self-awareness that is required for you to really truly heal yourself.
Mm-hmm. And I
Or
think that's one of the things you do differently, right? You help our clients recognize that.
yeah, because I learned, and I think, Leslie, when you first came on board with me about 7 years ago, the kind of work we were doing then was very superficial at best, right?
Mm-hmm.
Functional medicine was all the rage. And so I wanted to know more about it. But then when I went to apply it for my life, there were so many big holes missing. Like, what do? I know how to do an elimination diet. I'm taking the progesterone and I'm taking the B vitamins because I have MTHFR, taking all the supplements by the handfuls. But I would go home and be so anxious because I don't know what's going to happen with my ex-husband at that time when I get home. So I had unease everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And if I wasn't going to fix that, nothing else would change. And I remember you coming to me, you said the same thing when you were working with your patients. I know what they should do, but the compliance was the issue. They know what to do, but they don't follow through. So you were like, oh my gosh, what do we do? Well, the problem is, we said, we don't fix them. They have to take their own responsibility. And then we guide them, we mentor, we coach them.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I learned was a true integration, or an expert integrator like you, it's needed in business, but it's also same is true for health and wellness and healing for chronic illness patients, especially those living with gut issues, right? Because if you don't tie in all the aspects of your life, it's not separate from one another. I can follow an impeccable diet and exercise to my max every night, but then I go to the workplace every day from 8 to 5, and it's a toxic environment where I'm stressed to the max. I go home, repeat the same clean diet, even at work, and go to the yoga classes at night. You and I both know nothing changes.
Right.
So we treat everybody holistically through experiencing what it's like to do what it is, like applying functional medicine, living the functional medicine model with all the pillars attached to it to set the foundation for their healing to occur, no matter what, right?
Mm-hmm.
Requires their responsibility. And then second thing is to integrate that into their own bodies, mind-body connection, so that you can read what your body is asking of you, what it needs if it's hungry, right? And really respecting and honoring that with self-awareness. And then the third thing that's missing in this holistic world is the coaching aspect of it, where when they come across a stumbling block, a roadblock that kind of keeps them stuck, we can coach them through their blind spots to work that out. And lastly, we can then create a community of like-minded individuals where they feel safe and heard and supported and held accountable. And we're always uplifting each other. And so that's really the vision for everything that came to be, because it's really what I needed. And that's what our vision for our practice and our programs, Leslie,
Mm-hmm.
is all about that, right? Experience, integration, coaching, and community. And it's functional yoga medicine at its best because it's a lifestyle solution.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we get into part 2 of this series, and especially part 3, I think we're just going to talk more about how functional yoga medicine came to be through your experience with all the education you have. So just to sum it up for the end of this episode, focusing on relationships, what would you tell somebody who is just starting to recognize that maybe their home life, their spouse, their relationship with their kids, or maybe a relationship at work is causing them stress, and that could be adding to their symptoms, their gut issues, or even other chronic illness. What
It's
would you
not
suggest for them?
adding to, Leslie, it's not could be adding to, but I believe it is causing their stress in all those relationships that you mentioned, absolutely causing
Okay.
their illness.
Right.
And so I just want them to recognize it, because you can't fix something you're unaware of, right? And recognize that it's not each relationship. It's not your career's fault. It's not your husband's fault, your best friend or coworker's fault, or even your kids, right? It's when you start to cultivate awareness, you recognize it's fully your responsibility, and then you start to shift your perspective enough so that you're able to then understand that, oh my gosh, my perspective is my own. So my thoughts are up to me. My feelings are up to me. Therefore, my behavior is up to me. And you start to think about, what is it that's important to me? And then once that's established, your relationship with yourself, and that gets more clear, I promise everybody, and we've witnessed this together, Leslie, everything else starts to fall into place.
Right.
That is no longer gritting teeth through it, following somebody else's idea of it, but it's your own, and you know what you need. And so we're not so dependent on other people to fix us, and we are not wavering anymore. We stand our ground, and we know exactly what our body needs. And that's the most liberating and empowering feeling to have.
Wonderful. I think you explained that very well. And I think everybody can start to grasp that. So thank you, Dr. Connie. I think this was great. A great part one. For everybody that's listening, stay tuned, because in part two, we're going to have Dr. Connie talk more about her personal health journey leading up to her diagnosis, plus everything she's tried, because you've tried everything, haven't you, Dr. Connie?
Yes. And what's worked and what hasn't. And I promise it's going to give our audience so much insight in how to read what's working and what's not.
Awesome. Any last words that you want to share with our audience?
No, I just want to tell those who needs to hear it the most that no matter where you are, if you stay clear about who you are, and you live in pursuit of you fulfilling your most inner desires and stay in alignment, true to yourself, I promise healing is inevitable, no matter what. And I'm living proof of that. So I just want to thank you, Leslie. Thanks to our audience, and follow me for more at Dr. Connie Cheung.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Dr. Connie.
Thank you, guys. Bye.